right, so we're starting James today. So this is one of the Catholic epistles, meaning one of the universal epistles. You'll find it toward the back of the New Testament before Peter, Jude, and John. All right.
I got it right here.
So we start off. Well, first, let me say we think that this letter was written by James, the stepbrother of the Lord. Or so he was, according to the Orthodox tradition, the brothers of the Lord that are mentioned in the New Testament are the children of Joseph, Jesus's father, human father. But so therefore there's not a blood relation. So they're called stepbrothers of the Lord. So Joseph, contrary to how he's often portrayed in movies and so on, wasn't a young man. He was an older man who had been married before and he was a widower, and he had children from that marriage. So these are older brothers, older siblings of Jesus. So James is an older stepbrother of Jesus, and he becomes the first bishop of Jerusalem. So and at that time, Jerusalem was kind of like for us, Constantinople is today. It was the center of the faith, and he was the bishop of the center of the faith. So he was kind of like ecumenical patriarch, something like that. And we think that this letter was written in 48 AD. So very early on. Paul's first letter is from 49 AD. So we think that this was written just before Paul starts founding communities. And so a lot of times, we'll get into it later, but a lot of times people see conflict between James and Paul's letters, especially in this debate about faith versus works, which we'll get into in chapter 1, actually. But that's not correct. This is a misunderstanding based on later Protestant theologians like Martin Luther, who wanted to emphasize faith alone. So we'll see that as we go. So the interesting thing here is he starts off by saying, James, a bondservant, or really slave, a slave of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. So he's calling himself a slave of his own brother. But the fact that Jesus has been exalted as Lord kind of wipes away these human relationships. He declares himself the slave of the Lord Jesus Christ. And then he says, to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad, greetings. So this is a very simple opening for an ancient letter, just saying who he is, who it's addressed to, and then his opening is simply the word greetings, hierete. Paul's openings tend to be a little bit longer, which is more typical. But if we look, interestingly, in Acts 15, which we did a while ago, Acts 15 is the Jerusalem Council, where there's this debate going on. Paul has gone out, he's starting communities, mainly Gentiles are coming in, and there's this big debate about whether these Gentiles need to be circumcised and become Jews in order to become Christians. Paul says no, but some Jewish believers say yes, they need to be circumcised. So they gather together at this Jerusalem council that's presided over by James in Acts 15. And at the end of their deliberations, James issues a statement, a letter that he sends out saying no, they don't need to be circumcised, but here are the things that they need to follow, which were laws from the Old Testament, which were required of non-Jews living in Israel. Which meant avoiding blood and meat, avoiding sexual immorality, etc. But the interesting thing there is in that epistle that's quoted in Acts that James sent out, the first line is also simply greetings, which is unusual to be so short. So this gives credence to the idea that we're dealing with the same author, that it's again James, the brother of the Lord. And when he says to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad. So remember, at this time, there's only 2 tribes left in Israel. There's Benjamin and Judah. The 10 northern tribes had been scattered 700 years before this, in 721 BC. So who are these 12 tribes? Well, if you remember back from our study of Romans, Paul talks about this, that the 12 tribes, in the Jewish kind of understanding, the northern 10 tribes had been scattered by the Assyrians. So the Assyrians came in, defeated Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel, and deported many of the Jews of those northern 10 tribes. And then the Jews that were left of the northern 10 tribes, the Assyrians sent in Assyrians. So they mixed up these populations, right? And then the Jews from the northern 10 tribes end up being scattered over all the earth, over all the Mediterranean world at that time. So what Paul says in Romans is that this was divinely planned, because then the Jews from these northern 10 tribes went, mixed with all the populations of the earth, scattered around the Mediterranean, mixed with Gentiles, and therefore opened Israel to, so when he talked about the 12 tribes in a time when only the 2 tribes were left, he's talking about the whole world, basically. He's talking about all the Jews everywhere and those they have mixed with throughout the Mediterranean world. So this is a universal or Catholic epistle. And James, so 2 times now we have James in Acts 15 sending out a letter declaring the decision of the council. And now he's sending out another letter. And so if we look back in Jewish history, the chief priest, the high priest of the Jews, would also send out encyclical letters, meaning open letters. He would send out to the whole diaspora, all the Jewish synagogues of the whole Mediterranean, regarding various decisions, regarding which taxes that they should send in, etc. So James is acting the same way as the chief priest of Jerusalem by sending out this universal letter. And this tradition, it continues for the last 2,000 years to our day, where the bishops send out encyclicals, especially the ecumenical patriarch on all the major feasts. He sends out an encyclical, and he might send out other instructions by an encyclical, meaning a letter that cycles around all the communities. All right, so now verse 2, he gets into the main body of the text. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. All right, so the word there, trials, is pirasmos. Anybody know? Anybody except Jim know what pirasmos means? So temptation, exactly. So temptation, pirasmos is a word still used in modern Greek, especially in church circles, I would say, talking about a temptation or a trial, something that comes along in your life that tests your faith, that maybe is so powerful that it has the potential to make you deny your faith or to fall away from your faith. So the various trials. So what various trials, pirasmos, temptation, what could they be? They could be a divorce, death of a loved one, things like this.
Hurricane. Hurricane.
Hurricane, yes, hurricane, something that makes you question the goodness and sovereignty of God. So he says counterintuitively here, he says, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, when various temptations, trials befall you, count it as a joy, because you know that the testing of your faith, and the testing here is the word meaning something like how they would test gold, where they would put gold into a fire and the fire would burn off the impurities that would test the gold. So this testing of your faith, meaning through fire, this testing through the temptation and the trial, is actually a way to purify your faith, even though it's painful. It involves pain. So he says, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. So by going through these various trials and temptations, losing a loved one, a divorce, something like that, that tests your faith in God, it actually, going through this, produces patience in you. So you learn to endure all things with patience. Verse 4, but let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. So in other words, let this patience run its course, so that through this testing of your faith, you can perfect your faith. So in other words, like the gold being purified by fire, so that your faith is perfect and whole, complete. 5, if any of you lacks wisdom, now, so here he's saying, in other words, if you lack discernment to see the goodness that is coming, the reason why you should count it as joy when you fall into these temptations. If any of you lacks the wisdom to see this, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to him. So God is pictured as this father who will not, if his child comes to him and asks for something, he's not going to reproach him for asking for something, for being too weak, etc. He's going to give it to him freely, liberally. This wisdom and discernment. 6, but here's the condition of asking God for this wisdom and discernment. But let him, the person of faith, ask in faith, with no doubting. For he who doubts is like a wave of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. And here when he says doubt, it's not so much in the sense of like, we tend to think of doubt in terms of, in our age, in the modern age, in terms of intellectual doubt about, does God really exist? Here he means more moral doubt, so practical action doubt. Yeah, without doubting, for he who doubts is like a wave of the sea driven and tossed by the wind. 7, for let not that man suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. So he won't receive the wisdom and discernment if he asks with doubt. He is a double-minded, literally the word is double-souled, double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. So someone who vacillates between being faithful and not being faithful. So this is more than having faith or not having faith. It's more the sense of being faithful or not being faithful. In other words, continuing to keep the commandments of God, continuing to try to please the Lord morally, rather than just kind of an intellectual doubt. Does that make sense?
Well, we all do that. That's
Yeah,
what I was thinking.
yeah. So,
We all do that.
yeah,
Somehow or another,
especially
every day or every other day or whatever.
intellectually or in practice.
Well, I think like anytime we sin,
Yeah.
we're sinning.
Yeah,
We're
that's
falling away from our faith.
that's what he means by being double-minded. So,
Yeah,
yeah,
I mean, if we were perfect, we wouldn't sin,
right. Right.
but we're not. gonna.
What would it mean, like doing the same sin over and over and over again and keep
Yeah.
repenting, but you keep doing that?
Yeah, I think he would picture that as being pushed by the waves. You know, one minute you're being faithful to God, you're strong in your faith, the next minute you're pushed back, you fall into sin. He would picture this as being pushed about by the waves.
Stronger.
Yeah,
Hey, can I ask you this question?
Yeah.
Because he also says, is it 7 times 70 or how many times he's gonna
forgive.
forgive us?
Yeah,
So and that sort of
Right.
gives you that picture that,
it's always going back and forth. Yeah, but he's encouraging us here to not be that way, to be firm in our faith.
to be strong.
Word that's doubt, like waver and
Waver, yeah.
try to judge apart something. Like the Bible academics, they take it words and pick it apart and
Yeah.
say it could mean this or that. It seems like he's talking against them. You shouldn't be doing that stuff
Right.
because it destroys people's faith.
Right, yeah, and this is a very modern phenomenon, you know, in terms of thinking about intellectually. Whether we're doubting God, because in the ancient world, before the Enlightenment, no one doubted the existence of God. Everyone knew that God existed, I mean, or a God existed. There were no atheists in the ancient world, really. That would be a weird idea. So here he's talking more about how do our actions show whether we're being faithful. All right, yeah,
From what I've learned, we all are inclined to specific sins, and I mean, Father. Paul has told me that I'll have the same ones till the day I die.
yeah,
I mean, they just keep coming back.
yeah.
It's true. I mean, I can see that it has since I was a teenager, really.
Yeah, I think all of us can relate to that probably. Yeah. But yeah, I think he's encouraging us to be more steadfast in our faith, you know, and not to be pushed back by the wave of the sea, as we often are. But yeah, at the same time, I don't think he's not excluding us, you know, the fact that we fall, you know, at least we get up and come back. That's the important thing. So we're trying to be resolute. We're trying not to be double-minded, and we're trying not to be unstable in all our ways. So this image of being driven on the sea was common in Greek literature and in the Jewish wisdom texts. Jewish wisdom texts mean texts like Proverbs, Sirach, etc., Ecclesiastes. In the context of James, asking for wisdom in faith means committing oneself to obey what God reveals. So that's the other thing is if we ask in faith for God to give us wisdom and discernment, we have to, when he reveals that to us, we need to actually be stable and firm in it. Let's see. All right. All right, verse 9. Let the lowly brother glory in his exaltation, but the rich in his humiliation, because as a flower of the field he will pass away. For no sooner has the sun risen with a burning heat than it withers the grass, its flower falls, and its beautiful appearance perishes. So the rich man also will fade away in his pursuits. So the poor here are exhorted to rejoice in the reversal of situations now within the Christian community, where they are raised up to experience equality with others and a special relationship with God. The rich, on the other hand, rejoice because in this new community, they are no longer honored because of wealth or status, but simply because they are Christians who are part of the community. So this contrast in exaltation and humiliation is reminiscent of Jesus' saying, Matthew 23, all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted.
It also sounds like the Beatitudes.
Yes, yes. And then Isaiah 40, Isaiah chapter 40, verses 7 and 8, it uses a similar language. The grass withers, the flower fades, when the breath of the Lord blows upon it. Surely the people are grass. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God will stand forever. So James is using language that he's familiar with from Isaiah. All right, and so if James is writing to, it's likely that James is writing to people in Palestine and Syria, Jewish Christians. At this time in 48 AD, almost all the Christians are going to be non-Gentiles. They're going to be Jews who have come to accept Jesus. And many of them we know would have been poor. We know that a famine struck about this time in Palestine and Syria. That's the reason that Paul ends up starting a collection that we talked about in his epistle on Sunday from 2 Corinthians chapter 9. He started this collection of all his Gentile churches to relieve the suffering and the poverty in Palestine and Syria. So James is writing here probably to most of his people would have been poor. So this is why he's encouraging them. But there would have been some rich in the congregation as well. Let's see. All right, verse 12. Blessed is the man who endures temptations, pirasmos, trial. For when he has been approved, in other words, when his faith has been through the fire and shown to be pure gold, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. All right, this is so like we say in the Lord's Prayer, and lead us not into temptation. So, which is, it kind of strikes us as odd, asking the Lord not to lead us into pirasmos, which is the same word in the Lord's Prayer. But the idea is that we shouldn't think of God as a vengeful God who is trying to get us. So, someone might be tempted to say if they lose a loved one, let's say, that you might hear people say, this is probably more in the ancient world, but someone might say God is tempting me, God is punishing me, something like that. But he's saying, don't let anyone say that this temptation, this pirasmos, is a punishment from God. For God cannot be tempted by evil. God, in other words, is not evil or not vengeful. And so he doesn't attempt anyone himself.
Would you say that just like God knows our desires and our hearts and everything, so does the devil? He
Mm,
knows our desires, he knows our weaknesses,
yeah,
so he's the one that's tempting us,
exactly.
because he knows where we're weak.
Right, which is why we say in the Lord's Prayer, deliver us from evil or the evil one. He's the one who's tempting us, not God. And then when it says here in 14, each one is tempted when he is, so where do these temptations come from? Well, it comes when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then, when desire has conceived, so he's describing this process by which sin takes place. So first, we have our own desires, and I've talked about this a lot in sermons, which in the Orthodox Church, we call them passions. These kind of unruly desires, these bad desires that we have, maybe for too much food or lust, or, you know, any of these, or for too many material things, etc. So when we're drawn away by our own evil desires, unruly desires, and enticed, then desire is conceived, right? So, and the saints talk about this a lot, that, you know, how we combat thoughts. Thoughts are the first stage of sin. So, and in the ancient world, they pictured thoughts not as coming from internally from the brain, but as coming from the outside. So this idea of the angel and the devil sitting on your demon, sitting on your shoulder. The thoughts would be kind of put in by angels or demons, would flash across your mind. And these thoughts are not evil if we don't engage them, like how Saint Paisios, the modern saint, talks about them as he says, picture it like an airport and you're watching planes fly overhead. So those are the planes, are the thoughts, some good, some evil. But if we don't, he says, if we don't start waving them down like the guy with the flags, if we don't engage them, then it's not a sin. But once we start waving them down, once we start engaging with the sin, with the evil thought, then that's when, what does he say? When desire is conceived. So that's when, so for example, we get a thought, I mean, sometimes, I mean, we get all kinds of evil thoughts or strange thoughts. I mean, it's a lot of times people report them in liturgy, even, you know, having this weird thought come out of nowhere. But if we don't start thinking about it and say, well, that's actually a good idea, you know, maybe a thought of, I'm bored, I'm gonna leave the liturgy. If we don't start thinking, well, maybe I could do that, yeah, I should just leave and go have a drink or something. Then it's not a sin, but once we kind of start pondering it and say, that's actually not a bad idea. Then desire is conceived and then it gives birth to sin. So first the thought, then we kind of start entangling with the thought, and then we give action to the thought, and that gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. So this is the same thing that Paul says, that sin is what brings about death. All right, so sin was, you know, before Adam and Eve sinned, there was no death. Once they sinned, death entered into the world. All right, so the Venerable Bede was an English Orthodox Christian in the 600s, and the major historian of Christianity in England. And he says there are 3 stages in temptation. The first is suggestion, the second is experiment, and the third is consent. If we resist the devil's suggestions, then we have victory over temptation and deserve to inherit the crown of life. So if we resist those thoughts, if we don't engage them. But if we let the enemy's suggestions gradually take control of us, then we find that we are taken away from the right path and start to indulge in sin. However, if we go no further than initial experiments, we may have offended God, but we have not yet fallen into mortal sin. However, if we continue down the path of depravity and start to embrace evil doing by giving our full consent to it, then we are deserving of death and the enemy has triumphed over us. So these stages of sin.
We are deserving of death.
Well, yeah, that's what he says. Well, meaning that
We've chosen.
the biological death that we all suffer, we've made it our own. just like Adam and Eve, so Adam and Eve committed the first sin and inherited biological death.
Alfred, that is on the roof. That you
And
remember?
also the shin things.
Nejua,
Sorry.
Sorry,
it's okay. Let's see. Yeah, just make sure you guys are on mute. But if you have a question, please let us know.
I don't know how to mute. I'm trying to mute mine, but I just couldn't. I'm trying, it is not working for my phone, sorry.
Okay,
Can you,
I'm trying to figure out how I can mute you, but I don't see it.
Yeah, there.
I'm muted now, I can mute it.
Okay, all right.
Maybe
All right, so now verse 16. Do not be deceived, my beloved brethren. And here, I think he uses the word brethren 15 times in this short epistle, which is interesting because, you know, he's the stepbrother of the Lord. He's the Bishop of Jerusalem. He's the first among equals. He's the new chief priest, the new high priest of Christianity, but he's using these very egalitarian terms like brethren. He's not lording it over them. Do not be deceived, my beloved brethren. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above and comes down from the Father of lights. Does anyone recognize this?
Yeah.
Where is it from? In the liturgy, yes, good. With whom, in other words, God, the Father of lights, there is no variation or shadow of turning. So in other words, there's no, God is completely light. There's no area where there's a shadow in him. There's no darkness in him at all. There's no spot of evil in him. There's no variation or shadow of turning. He's completely light.
turning towards you.
Yes. 18, of his own will, he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. So of his own will, so not by any doing of our own, he brought us forth by the word of truth, meaning that by the gospel, by having the gospel preached to us, by hearing about the Lord Jesus Christ, we were brought forth for salvation, for eternal life, that we may be kind of a first fruits of his creatures. So first fruits is a technical term from the Old Testament. Before the tithe is introduced into the Old Testament, the word that is used is first fruits, and they kind of come to mean the same thing. But it's this idea of the first fruits are what in the oldest parts of the Old Testament were what the people of Israel offered to God. So the first fruits of their harvest, the first fruits of their flock, the best of those things they would offer to God. And later it becomes kind of defined as 10%. But what it means here is that we as Christians, especially at this time where the Christians are very small population, that they will be kind of this first offering of humanity back to God, right? So the first fruits of what is to come, so that there will be more fruits later. There will, if that makes sense. All right, 19. So then, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. For the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God. And this is, I think, a well-known verse also. Swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. So to be quick to hear implies eagerness to put into practice what has been heard. Two things in particular are indicative of spiritual maturity: the ability to hold one's tongue and a willingness to be generous toward those who are in need. A charitable disposition and charitable behavior must go hand in hand in the life of someone who wants to imitate God's perfect charity. So imitate, the Venerable Bede says, imitate God's justice, which is without anger. Avoid uncontrollable fury, which leads to a habit, becoming a habit. Let's see, St. Augustine says about this verse, truth is more safely heard than preached. For when it is heard, lowliness is preserved, humbleness. But when it is preached, some bit of boastfulness, arrogance may steal in almost unawares, and this brings corruption. So, in other words, it's easier to hear than it is to hear humbly than it is to speak humbly. And then the Bede says, James is right to say this, for it is stupid to think that someone who is not prepared to learn from others will somehow be well equipped to preach to them. Someone who wants to become wise must first of all ask for this gift from God, as James has already said. Then he must find himself a good teacher, and in the meantime, discipline his tongue so that he says nothing useless, but restricts himself to preaching the truth which he has recently learned from others. Let's see. And then Bede also says about anger, slow to anger. Even if anger seems justified in human terms, it can never be right in God's eyes. A human judge who loses his temper, even if his decision is the right one, cannot imitate the justice of God, who always judges in perfect tranquility of mind. All right, and David says in the Old Testament, be angry, but do not sin. This means that we must be careful when we get angry, not to let it develop into an uncontrollable fury. This is where those who are slow come into their own. It may be wrong to be slow in other things, but when it comes to anger, tardiness is the right policy, because by the time we get around to it, the reasons for it may have dissipated.
Like God in the temple.
Yeah, yeah,
Sometimes people are very proud that they're angry about something.
yes, especially in our age, I think. There's a lot of, yeah, virtue signaling, they call it, like being angry about this or that that's going on in politics or in the world. But James is telling us to be slow to anger. So we can disagree with something that's happening in the world, but we should maintain a tranquility of mind, as it says. All right, 21. Therefore, lay aside all filthiness and overflow of wickedness, and receive with meekness the implanted word, which is able to save your souls. So here the implanted word, something that has become implanted, it may be related to the new covenant prophecy in Jeremiah 31, where God promises, I will put my law within them and I will write it upon their hearts. So this implanted word could mean that God, this idea that God has written on our hearts, his new covenant, his new law, or it could mean hearing the gospel like a seed has been planted into our hearts. 22. But be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. So why does he say this? In the Jewish world of the time, the Jews were so proud of the law that they often rejoiced simply in hearing the law. Even when it was read in Hebrew, which many of them didn't understand, it was read in Hebrew in the synagogues maybe. Just hearing it was considered a blessing, right? But he's saying, be doers of the word and not hearers only. And Paul says the same thing in Romans. It's the doers of the word, not hearers who are justified, Paul says. 23. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man observing his natural face in a mirror. For he observes himself, goes away, and immediately forgets what kind of man he was. So what does that mean? So it's kind of a little bit confusing, but the idea is this, that someone would, and in the ancient world at this time, they had mirrors, but they weren't like our mirrors that are so clear. They were more rudimentary and you wouldn't get such sharp detail, but you would see a reflection. So the idea is that a man goes to the mirror to check his face. And presumably, you go to get yourself ready in the morning, especially in the ancient world where there's a lot of dust and so on, dirt, and you would check yourself in the mirror. And if there was dust or dirt on your face, you would see it in the mirror and you would wash it off. But he's saying that being a hearer of the word and not a doer is like going to the mirror, seeing that there's dirt on your face, and then leaving and not doing anything about it. This is silliness.
In the ancient world used for mirrors.
I think it was, do you know?
There's like bronze, they
Bronze.
polish it.
Right.
And if you're rich, you might have silver, but you have to repolish it, tarnishes. So I don't know
Yeah, I think-
how well you can see it, it's like a really shiny plate or something.
Yeah, that's what I pictured it to be like in a plate. So 25. But he who looks into the perfect law of liberty, so he's comparing, looking into, and looks into means really literally the word is stoops down. In other words, when you really get up close and inspect something, when you look and inspect the perfect law of liberty, God's law, and continues and continues in it, in other words, and does it, and is not a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work, this one will be blessed in what he does. So in other words, he's saying that looking into the mirror and seeing the dirt on your face is like looking into the law of God and seeing where you're falling short, seeing where you're sinning. And then being not like the silly man who then just walks away and doesn't clean the dirt off his face. It would be silly for you to look into the perfect law of liberty, God's law, see your own sinfulness, and then do nothing about it, just hear about it. But actually, the one who is blessed is the one who will look into the law and then correct himself, clean himself. And so this become doers of the word is probably the best summary of the whole letter of James. Yeah,
I think it's very different than Bible study today, because you hear the words not written down
right.
and then plant it in your heart. That means you have to memorize it or make it part of you, and then you have to do it. It doesn't say about memorizing Bible verses or you know,
Right.
reading it or anything like that. So
Well, there's so Richard Bauckham wrote a commentary that kind of leverages Soren Kierkegaard. James was his favorite book of the Bible. But Bauckham makes a statement that there's a third option that modern scholarship reveals, that it's the process of looking at the mirror and only seeing the mirror. So not seeing yourself at all in it, but only kind of processing this,
Yes,
reading it for the
Intellectual.
for the intellectual benefit of it, and not actually seeing yourself in it at all, forgetting the fact that we are supposed to see ourselves actually reflected in this.
right.
This is what Kierkegaard says is, he refers to New Testament scholarship as humanity's prodigious invention, put space between itself and the New Testament. So it's this idea of this abstraction layer where you only see the mirror in
Yeah,
your studies.
or worse yet, you see other people. You look into the law of liberty and you judge other people by
Why
it.
does he call it, excuse me, the law of liberty?
He's got God's law, this new covenant that's been written into our hearts, the teaching of Jesus is the law of freedom. And this is why it's a kind of paradox that it's a law that we're subject to, but it's actually the law of freedom. By voluntarily submitting to the law of God, that's the path to true freedom.
And we have free will.
And we have free will, yes. So real freedom is voluntarily submitting to God's law, to Christ's law. All right. All right, 26. If anyone among you thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his own heart, this one's religion is useless. Pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their trouble, and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. So this is, James makes some kind of strong statements in the next chapter too, in chapter 2, when he talks about works versus faith. So here he's saying your religion is useless if you're not able to bridle your own tongue, and if you deceive your heart, presumably in this idea of hearing the word only and not doing it, not applying it to yourself, not cleaning your own face. And here is pure and undefiled religion. Real religion is this: to visit orphans and widows in their trouble, to care for, in other words, the poorest and most vulnerable in society. In the ancient world, orphans and widows there was no social safety net for them. They were really on their own. They were completely at the mercy of others. So to visit them, not only to visit them, but to care for them in their trouble, is an act of pure and undefiled religion. And then also, secondly, to keep oneself unspotted from the world. So I talked about this a couple of weeks ago in a sermon about avoiding worldliness, right? This is what James is talking about here. James is saying, not to detach yourself necessarily from society, from the world, but to be inwardly detached from society, inwardly detached from the expectations or pressures of society, to not be compelled to follow the crowd. In other words, to do that which is according to God's law rather than society's whims. this is keeping ourselves unspotted from the world.
Is there an interface there, like you see the, like the DDK uses the terminology two ways, there's kind of these two ways of, are they kind of swimming in the same waters? And
Yeah.
these ideas of
I
double
think so.
mind, and then later he says double, like two tongue, two souls. Sort of
Yes,
this almost like Deuteronomistic
Yes.
splitting of things.
yes, so he's talking about the two ways in Deuteronomy. I lay before you, Moses says to the people of Israel, I lay before you today two ways, two paths. One is the path to God and one is the path away from God and toward the world. And the Didache that he's talking about is a document probably from around the year 60 or so. That was a very early Christian document about kind of internal church rules and community order, how community order was kept in the early Christian community. And it also talks about the two ways, that there's the way toward God and there's the way toward the world. And these are two separate paths. One leads to blessings, as Moses says, and one doesn't. Let's see. Okay, all right, so that's the end of chapter 1. Anybody have any questions, thoughts?
Why did he write this?
What's that?
Why did he write this?
Why did he write this letter? So it's that's a good question. It's what we would call wisdom, probably literature. In other words, it's full of practical advice, you know, in the vein of other Jewish literature like Proverbs or Sirach. Why would he write it? You know, that's a good question. I would think that he sees as the pastor of the Christian community, he feels a certain responsibility for his people, and he sees certain tendencies, maybe. It seems like he's probably seeing a certain tendency of people to hear the word only and not do it, that they say they have faith, but they're not faithful. They don't act on this faith. They're being pushed around by the world like a wave in the sea. And he's writing to encourage them to like a good pastor. That's how I would interpret it.
To whom did he send it first?
So, well, we don't know for sure, but he addresses it to the 12 tribes of Israel. So like you were saying, you know, meaning everybody. So that's why it's considered a Catholic or universal epistle. So he meant it to be widely read. But at this time, like I was saying earlier, it's before Gentiles have really entered into Christianity. So you're looking at Jewish Christians across the Mediterranean.
We also have letters from Gamaliel, or at least attributed to Gamaliel around the same time that are kind of sent out to the diaspora.
Yeah.
So in that sense, like in the Jewish context, I think the question would more be, like it would feel odd that he wouldn't have sent this letter out
Yes.
to this, rather than, you know, Paul definitely declares his occasions for writing the letters. Here, it seems more like you would expect it, specifically James in his position would write this letter.
Right. Gamaliel was a famous rabbi around the 1st century, and according to Acts, Paul studied under Gamaliel. Gamaliel was like considered the most famous rabbi of the time, so he would whatever he wrote would be widely accepted by the Jews.
And I think also maybe to simplify life for the Jews
Yeah.
and their faith, putting everything in basically black and white. form.
I mean, it's really reads like a sermon, really. So it's trying to interpret the commandments of God in a practical way for people. Here's what you can
To live.
do, how to live. All right. Chapter 2, verse 1. My brethren, do not hold the faith of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory, with partiality. For if there should come into your assembly, and the word there is synagogue, this is before, it's not the word ecclesia. It seems like at this point, ecclesia is not the common term for the assembly. It's still synagogue. So you're dealing with this Jewish background. For if there should come into your synagogue assembly a man with gold rings and fine apparel, and there should also come in a poor man in filthy clothes, and you pay attention to the one wearing the fine clothes and say to him, you sit here in a good place, and say to the poor man, you stand there, or sit here at my footstool, or actually it says literally sit here under my footstool, which means that, you know, someone rich would be sitting with his feet up on a stool and you would sit on the ground next to him, next to his feet. which is considered the most unseemly part of the body, the dirtiest part of the body, so it's really a low position. So he says, if you do this, have you not shown partiality among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? So I always think when I read this, there's a story, I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, but there's a story of, I think it's probably true, that this pastor in America, he was in a Protestant church, he was hired by this church, by the board, or what we would call the parish council. And the first Sunday, he shows up, but he's dressed as a beggar, as a homeless man. And he wants to see how the community is gonna treat him. And they don't treat him very well, right? So they tell him to, stand in the back, they don't try to help him or anything. And then he comes up at the time of the sermon, and he kind of takes off his disguise, and he reams them out for not doing exactly what it says here. So that gives you an idea of what James means here.
It's
So,
kind of our nature to do this.
yes, our human tendency
It's
is,
wrong, but
yes, exactly. So this is why he has to warn against it. Let's see,
Oftentimes, such people are gross looking, or they're dirty,
right,
or they have some deformity, or
right,
you figure they must have a disease.
yeah.
So you're not inclined to get up in their face.
Right, and it's hard, you need discernment, like you need wisdom in order to, but that's something that I think all churches struggle with, especially downtown churches like ours, where we have sometimes a homeless person who wanders into the church. And, keeping this in mind, we can't, there's a fine line between security, on the one hand, you're responsible for the people who are there, so you have to have some security. But at the same time, you have to keep this in mind that, it could be Christ in disguise, who's coming to visit you as a homeless man. So how do you balance those things? How do you not show partiality?
Would be a natural time to say to suspect them of stealing.
Yes,
To be worried about their stealing.
exactly, yeah. So in Roman laws explicitly favored the rich, or persons of lower class who could not bring accusations against persons of higher class. And the laws prescribed harsh penalties for lower class persons convicted of offenses against those of a higher class. This is where we get the satisfaction theory of atonement from. Are you guys familiar with this? This is in the 11th, this is kind of I would say the general understanding of Jesus's work on the cross for us here in the West is that well, you hear this preached in Protestant churches a lot, that the idea was that Anselm of Canterbury in the 11th century, he said in feudal England at that time, it was like this. It was an inheritor of the Roman laws where if a person of a lower class committed an offense against someone of the same class, it was one penalty. But if you committed that same offense against someone of a higher class, it was a higher penalty. And so Anselm of Canterbury reasoned that, he said, well, look, God is of an infinitely higher class than we are, and we're all the way at the bottom in this lowest class. So when we offend against God by sinning, we owe this infinite penalty. And we couldn't possibly pay this infinite penalty because we're poor. And so the only way this debt could be satisfied was for God to pay it himself through his own son. So this is called the satisfaction theory of atonement. That, the idea of in the old movies, I demand satisfaction, and you slap somebody with the glove across the face, I demand satisfaction. My honor has been offended. I demand satisfaction. So this idea coming from Roman law, but biblical law and traditional Greek law, as opposed to traditional Greek philosophers, had always rejected such class distinctions as immoral.
Which law?
Biblical law and traditional Greek philosophy had always rejected such distinctions as immoral. And St. Augustine says about this idea of showing favoritism to the rich. He says, who could bear to see a rich man chosen to occupy a seat of honor in the church, when a more learned and holier man is passed over because he is poor? Is it not a sin to judge by appearances that a rich man is a better man? And then Hilary of Arles, Saint Hilary says, it is a sin to show any class distinction among persons. For the law says, you shall not be partial in judgment. You shall hear the small and the great alike. Jesus confirmed this when he said, do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment. And then St. John Chrysostom says, bear their greed as patiently as you can. Those people, the rich, destroy themselves, not you. For while they rob you of your money, they strip themselves of God's favor and help. For the one who bases his life on greed and gathers all the wealth of the world around him is in fact the poorest of all. All right, so verse 5, chapter 2, verse 5. Listen, my beloved brethren. So this is like a series of teachings of wisdom, little kind of nuggets of practical advice. So here he starts in another one. Listen, my beloved brethren. Has God not chosen the poor of this world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom which he promised to those who love him? But you have dishonored the poor man. Do not the rich oppress you and drag you into the courts? Do they not blaspheme that noble name by which you are called, meaning Christian? So he's talking to the poor Jewish Christians and saying, don't the rich, because at this time it was, there weren't so many rich who were becoming Christians, although there were some. So he's saying, don't these rich persecute you for being Christian? Especially this was true in the Jewish community. There was a lot of tension between the Jews, traditional Jews, and the Jews who had come to believe in Jesus. The traditional Jews would oppress them, try to kick them out of the synagogue, etc. All right, so James now goes on to, he was providing arguments in support of his conclusions that this favoritism is dishonorable. And he calls the poor rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom. And I think, we can see that this is true. Jesus talks about this as well, that the poor are rich in faith. It's almost easier to be more dependent on God when you're poor. And especially in light of last night, I don't know how many people were here last night talking about the Orthodox mission in Sierra Leone, one of the poorest countries in the world. And you see this faith of the people in Africa. It's a very vibrant, deep faith in God that they have, but it's at least partially, in my mind, tied to the fact that there's such abject poverty. And so there you see that the poor are really called to be rich in faith. Yeah.
Was there a Jewish thought at this time that if you were rich or did well, that God was favoring you or blessing you, and then if you were poor, maybe you offended God or something like that?
Yeah, was one of the kind of, that's how, it was almost like the prosperity gospel in Jewish times, that if you were blessed with riches, it meant God favored you. Yeah.
It wasn't just Jewish either, right? It was, I think that's part of the significance of like when Paul showed up infirm in some way and was accepted in, it was an odd thing because you would expect the messenger of God to show up.
Looking the part.
Right.
Right,
Yeah.
All right, let's see.
It's still prevalent today.
Yeah, we still have that idea today in the prosperity gospel. All right, 2:8. If you really fulfill the royal law according to the scripture, and then he cites here from Leviticus, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, which Jesus also cited as one of the 2 great commandments. So and he calls this the royal law, probably meaning because Jesus cited it and Jesus is king, therefore it's a royal law. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. If you really fulfill the royal law according to the scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, you do well. But if you show partiality, you commit sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. For whoever shall keep the whole law and yet stumble in one point, he is guilty of all. What does he mean? For he who said, do not commit adultery, also said, do not murder. Now, if you do not commit adultery, but you do murder, you have become a transgressor of the law. So speak and so do as those who will be judged by the law of liberty. For judgment is without mercy to the one who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. So what does he mean here? So it's not so much a moralism in terms of the law, but it's about the person of Jesus Christ, the person of God. Because it says, for he who said do not commit adultery also said do not commit murder. So when you transgress one of the laws, it's not just simply that you're transgressing this abstract moral code, but you're transgressing this relationship that you have with the one who issued those commandments, right? So speak and so do as one who will be judged by the law of liberty. Like he was talking about earlier, the Christ's law, the new covenant implanted in your heart. For judgment is without mercy to the one who has shown no mercy. And this sounds very much like the teachings of Jesus. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Mercy triumphs over judgment. So we should be merciful as the Heavenly Father is merciful, so that he will be merciful to us. All right. All right. The art of showing mercy. So St. John Chrysostom said about this mercy. He says, mercy is the highest art and the shield of those who practice it. It is the friend of God, standing always next to him and freely blessing whatever he wishes. It must not be despised by us. For in its purity, mercy's purity, it grants great liberty to those who respond to it in kind. It must be shown to those who have quarreled with us, as well as to those who have sinned against us. So great is its power. It breaks chains, dispels darkness, extinguishes fire, kills the worm, and takes away the gnashing of teeth. These are references to Jesus talking about the punishment at the end times. By it, the gates of heaven open with the greatest of ease. In short, mercy is a queen which makes men like God. And then Saint Hesychius says, just as oil enables athletes to escape the hands of their opponents, so in the ancient world, in the Olympics, wrestlers would be anointed with oil in order to make it harder for them to be grasped. So just like that, so mercy prepares those who practice it to avoid and escape the demons. So mercy is our path to salvation. All right, now here's where we get into the section. We'll probably have to talk about it more next time. We're almost out of time. But this is the section where James talks about faith and works, or faith versus works. 2:14. What does it profit, my brethren, if someone says he has faith, but does not have works? Can faith save him? If a brother or sister is naked and destitute of daily food, and one of you says to them, depart in peace, be warmed and filled, but you do not give them the things which are needed for the body, what does it profit? Thus also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. But someone will say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. You believe that there is one God. You do well. Even the demons believe and tremble. But do you want to know, O foolish man, that faith without works is dead? Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered Isaac his son on the altar in Genesis 22? You remember that story? Do you see that faith was working together with his works? And by works, faith was made perfect? And the scripture was fulfilled, which says, Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness. And he was called the friend of God. You see then that a man is justified by works and not by faith only. So faith only, the only time faith alone, the phrase faith alone or faith only appears in the New Testament and the scriptures at all is here in James. It does not say, contrary to Martin Luther, it never says in Ephesians that we are saved by faith alone or faith only. It doesn't say that. Martin Luther actually added the word only into his German translation of the Bible because it fit with his theology. And so Luther, because he has this theology of faith alone, salvation by faith alone, he rejected James. Luther called James an epistle of straw, meaning worthless. And he put it in the back of his Bible as like an appendix. So for this reason, in modern Protestantism, I would say James is maybe somewhat overlooked or not appreciated as much as it should be. James 2:25. Likewise, was not Rahab the harlot also justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out another way? This is from Joshua chapter 2. Rahab the harlot is a prostitute. So in other words, someone might say, well, okay, you cite Abraham as a model, as a friend of God and as a model of righteousness. But he says, I can give you another example. Rahab the harlot was justified. The prostitute was justified by works because she received the Israelite spies. And she helped send them out another way without being found in Jericho before the destruction of Jericho. So then he concludes this chapter, for as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead also. All right, so we'll pick up with that next time. Anybody have any final questions? All right, thank you all.